Welcome. My name is Christina Tallens, and I'm the Director of Modern Slavery Risk Assessments at the Wilberforce Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you to our 8th webinar here at the Business Academy. And in today's presentation, we're going to be talking about how we check for forced labor using the social audit approach. So some of those may have had some experience there, and some of you might not know what that is. But it's essentially it is where auditors visit a company to check people's working and living conditions, and we benchmark those conditions against local legislation and the ETI base code, the Ethical Trading Initiative base code. So with that in mind, over the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to be looking at the methods that we use when we're checking for forced labor, and just give you some ideas around how to tackle the problem if you actually come across it. So I would just like to point out that my presentation is being recorded, but we'll stop the recording when we come to questions at the end. And during the presentation, you're all very welcome to send in your questions using the chat box at the bottom of your screens. Obviously not the person driving the car, but you can send in questions later. At the end, there should be about 15 minutes for us to have go through the presentation or just go through any questions that you might have, or perhaps have a bit more of a group discussion. So given that we've got a lot of people here today, we may not be able to go through all of your questions, but if I need to, I can come back to you via email or privately if you need to get in touch. So without further ado, let's crack on. So let me give you a bit of background into who we are. So we are a world-leading research center. The Wilberforce Institute was set up in 2006, and we have team members that have an interdisciplinary focus. So we come from history, law, social sciences, and education. Most of the people that work at the Wilberforce Institute are academics, but I'm actually a practitioner, so I spend a lot of my time in the field. All of our team have either direct experience of dealing with forced labor, debt bondage, trafficking and smuggling in supply chains. We've all tackled one of those issues at some point. And our risk assessment services were set up in 2014 to try to help businesses address modern slavery, because we recognized even back then that it was a very complex issue for businesses to tackle. So can I just ask that everybody's on mute? Wonderful. Right. Let's go. My background is, like I said, I'm director of modern slavery risk assessments, but I also worked at Anti-Slavery International in the UK, France, Spain, and Italy. I am a social auditor through training, specialized in agriculture, and I've worked for audit firms like Intertech and Impact Limited. I did work on the UN Global Program against trafficking and smuggling of human beings, and so obviously was exposed to a lot of the issues around forced labor there. And then I worked for a big commodities company for about 7 years, and sat in the buying team, so I understand the pressures of buyers. But really, that's where I first came across the Ethical Trading Initiative, and worked alongside retailers and international brands. So why should we check for forced labor? Well, under the Modern Slavery Act, you may actually need to conduct checks of your suppliers and address any issues found. So that's the first reason. Secondly, it's the best way to have a social audit approach or risk assessment, which we sometimes use. It's the best way to identify poor labor and human rights practices on the ground, actually to be on the site to see how things are managed. Thirdly, you can help suppliers fine-tune your systems to protect themselves from modern slavery. So when you see gaps, when you're on a site and you see gaps, you can give them recommendations about how they could be addressing risks. And then finally, it's a way for you to actively manage your own supply chain and help you improve conditions for workers. The objectives for today, like I said, we've only got half an hour or so where I'll be going through the presentation, but it's to try to help you to understand what's meant by forced labor. Secondly, to check to understand how you can check for forced labor. So we'll use two approaches. One is, the management interviews and what you look at on the site. And the second approach is to check also with workers. look at any solutions and follow-up that you can have with suppliers. It's, like I said, it's a complex issue. So when you spot it, you should be trying to remediate it right there and then finally just cover off any questions that you might have. And I'll try to share some of the best practice that I've seen on the ground, and hopefully that will improve, provide everybody with some useful ideas. So employment is freely chosen. So under the Ethical Trading Initiative Base Code, there is the first provision, first and foremost, is no forced labor, but they say employment is freely chosen. So anybody that is working under threat or penalty is considered to be in a situation of forced labor under the ETI Base Code. So that goes from the most extreme cases of bonded and involuntary prison labor to the cases where people don't feel like they have a choice about whether they work overtime. So it's the whole spectrum there, from light to less light and, potentially very serious. There's a difference between bonded labor and forced labor. Bonded labor includes forcing a person to pay off a debt, which they or their family owe to the employer. And forced labor is it can also involve bonded labor, but really covers a wide array of mechanisms that are used to keep that person employed for that employer. So this can be done by making loans to workers, and attaching the terms of those loans for that worker to repay the employer back, so they can't leave before they finish paying off the loans, withholding workers' ID papers, or requiring workers to lodge deposits that they really can't live without or leave without, and then restricting the freedom of workers to leave after giving reasonable notice. So that's how the ETI base code would cover it. But you'll see when we start to conduct checks, it's lighter. It's a bit more. It goes from grey to. There are lots of areas of grey before you get to quite a serious situation. So the social audit approach, if some of you have not been through it, is to triangulate the data. There is always management interview and a site walk around. So we always do that. The management interview is really useful to start off with when you're on a site, because you're going to be able to give managers and the people that are running the companies the opportunity to give you an overview of the challenges that they're facing, either in sourcing labor or the challenges that they're facing as a company, even in terms of pricing, etc. So it gives you the context. I would always say ask for a HR manager to interview a HR manager, and then if there are shop stewards on the site, ask for shop stewards to be brought as well. Obviously, do those interviews separately. The second part of the triangulation of data is the worker interviews. So with a social audit, you would always have worker interviews. We've talked about risk assessments before. We don't always include worker interviews, and this is just because a social audit is a minimum of 2 days. So you have a lot more time to gather interviews and gather information and compile the data. With a risk assessment, you go in for a 6-hour day, and it's very quick. And sometimes it might be that you only have the opportunity to interview, 3 or 4 workers. What you need to understand when you interview workers is that, you must do no harm. So you mustn't leave the site with the possibility of one of them being fired or ending up in a worse condition than when you came across them. So, with the worker interviews, do a very wide selection of workers. Look out for any workers, for example, that are grouped or that are wearing different colors or that are doing heavier jobs than others, etc. So try to mix that to get an overview of what everybody's doing. And then the third part of the triangulation of data is document checks. So we always look at pay records. We look at hours and how hours are recorded. We look at disciplinary procedures and grievances. So I would also ask the HR person what type of complaints people have come to them with. And then finally, we have worker files. We look at contracts, terms and conditions, if there are any documents with loans, any fines, any money that's owed to the employer. So all of those things would be helpful for you to check. In terms of the key questions that you would have with forced labor, there are lots and lots of questions as you go through the ETI base code, but I've chosen some of my top favorite. If I was pushed for time, this is what I would ask. So, is everybody able to leave at the end of the shift? Do they have a shift times, or do people not know what the start and finish times are? If people don't know, that's usually a sign that it's too fluid, and it means that overtime can be sprung upon them at any time. If all your workers free to leave at any time if they give reasonable notice? What kind of notice do you need from them? So with workers that are in how can you say, more manual jobs, you'll often find that they are paid on a weekly basis. So normally the only notice that they should be giving is their weekly notice. So we usually attach that to the period of time that the payments that workers get, how often they're paid. So if you're paid weekly, you should normally only give 1 week notice. If you're paid monthly, it should be a 1 month notice. So it's always quite useful to keep that in your head. Can you confirm that no deposits are taken from workers? So tools, uniform, lockers. There might be deposits taken for living accommodation. There might be deposits taken for energy. Just check what is taken and what it's for, because that money will be owed to the worker. And if it's substantial, then they would be reluctant to leave unless that's being cleared up. Is there a verbal or written contract with each worker? I always put verbal because it's very important that workers are able to articulate what their terms and conditions are. So often, even, and this happens a lot with migrant workers or agency workers, they might get terms and conditions that they've not read through or that they've not fully understood. So there might be things in there that they have no idea that they've signed up to. So it might be excessive working hours, or it might be, you'll get paid on completion of the job, etc. So check what the verbal terms and conditions are, and whether they understand how often they should be paid and what the conditions are. If the company holds any ID or cards or papers, are they copies and not originals? So I went to a construction site a few months ago, and one of the managers took out all the construction site cards for all of the workers. They weren't ID cards, thankfully, but he shouldn't even have had those on him. So they should have just had a copy of those construction cards. And then finally, if loans are made to workers, is there a loan agreement in place? Is it capped? And is it signed by the worker? So I don't like loans. Generally speaking, I don't like to see them wherever I go. But there are some countries where people can't access bank loans. Agency workers also have a very hard time, if they're on 0-hour contracts, accessing bank loans. But if there are loans present, I would say it should never, ever exceed 25% of a worker's wage, whether it's weekly or monthly, just because it puts them in a situation of vulnerability later on and they're unable to pay it off. And it might affect their ability to have a living wage. So it then moves into a living wage issue as well. They might not have enough money to survive on or pay their rent, etc. So those are the questions that I would ask. If it was before you get to remediation ideas, with the worker interviews, I would then I would then choose a group interview, select workers in a group, and then do a few individual interviews. And the top questions that I would ask would be, did you pay somebody to get this job? So did somebody put you in touch? And it's not just their understanding of, did you pay them to get the job? Did you pay somebody to translate your documents? Did you pay somebody to put you in touch with the company or to upload your documents, etc.? All of those things are now considered hidden recruitment fees. So that could show there's a dependency there. Were you asked to pay a deposit when you joined? That's another one. Did you show your ID card? Did you get it back? Did anybody help you pay for transport and accommodation? That's not included, but that I would definitely put that in there. How is overtime arranged? So is it at the last minute? Are you happy to stay behind? Can you say no? So what we often find, and overtime is a complicated one because under the ETI base code, it will come up as forced labor. If a supervisor or a manager is saying to a worker, look, I'm not going to give you any more shifts if you don't stay behind because, you know, like we need you to stay over. So that particular phrase in itself would constitute a situation of forced labor because it's under threat or penalty of a perceived penalty for workers. And then what type of notice do you need to give? So those are the top questions that I would ask. I'm going to see if I can go back. So remediation ideas. If you do come across forced labor, what I would say is make sure that there is regular payment of wages. Like I said, if people are paid weekly, they should be paid weekly. They shouldn't be paid. Nobody should really be paid at the end of a job, because that just puts them in a situation of dependency. Secondly, that there's no false recruitment, that people, when we say, try to understand what the terms and conditions are, we're really saying check that what they were told before they were hired was correct. And it's in fact the job that they were promised and the job that they've been given. That's the verbal terms and conditions and written contracts. So if people are able to verbally articulate what the terms and conditions are, and they are the same as what the management has told me, and then nobody's breaking the law, it's just a verbal agreement, that is fine. For me, that would be fine. Sometimes in some countries, people can't read and write, and they're not going to, but I would like them to articulate what they have been told. We want to check that only copies of ID are taken. We want to make sure that there's no illegal recruitment fees or hidden recruitment fees for translation, etc. No deductions from pay. I would say look for disciplinary procedures. I don't necessarily mean that you should be looking for a policy. I mean, ask people what happens if how they discipline people if somebody's committed a fault. What happens if somebody's late? What happens if there is friction between colleagues? What happens if there's a problem with colleagues? So you want them to be able to tell you, look, there's a verbal warning once, then there's a written warning, then the second written warning. So you want them to be able to tell you that, at least verbalize it. Check worker voice mechanisms for grievances. A lot of the companies that I go to, especially in the UK, do not have a grievance mechanism that's open to agency workers. I would say this is a problem. So you always have to make sure that every worker on a site, whether it's a subcontractor or an agency worker or a temporary worker, knows that they can ring a hotline or that they can send an email or a WhatsApp message if they come across a problem that could be considered unethical. So you've got to give them those communication channels, and it's much better that they come to the company than they go to somebody external. I would say no excessive loans, and no threats or intimidation of workers to do their shifts. Those are the remediation ideas. Finally, I haven't done I did do worker documents. So I've given you a bit of an overview of how we would deal with forced labor, or how we would check. Obviously, a social audit approach is much heavier than that, so we're just doing the top line here. If anybody would like further training, there are some modules that we have available at the Wilberforce Institute, and here on the bottom left, you can you can see an email there. That's the person that runs the online module, so you can do a little bit more training on there, or you've got a QR code at the right, and that will take you to the Wilberforce Institute training. But really, the one that I find the most useful is an introduction to modern slavery. So this talks about different types of modern slavery, which is forced labor, the pattern of recruitment, coercion, the control of victims, any trafficking routes, source and destination countries, nationalities, and then practice developments in law enforcement and development between cooperation between agencies and countries, and then rapid access to other research and new briefings.